awful lot about off-chain data, how to store it, how to use it, where the variables are. You're going to use off-chain data whether you're working with an Oracle or with something else. We're going to kind of talk about what it is, and how it works, and why it works the way it works. So off-chain data is basically data that you're using all the time that doesn't necessarily reside inside of a blockchain block. Right now, blockchain blocks, they're really good. They hold transaction, they hold wallet, they hold a lot of interesting information. But some of the distributed applications that we're building have to have outside data coming in because we need to be able to understand what's going on. So say I'm doing some IoT thing, I need weather data, I need a public data feed so I can do weather prediction. So I know when I should plant corn or when I should plant wheat, right? We can do hedging markets, we can do dynamic NFTs, we can do temperature, we can do a bunch of other kind of weather data. All that's not going to be stored in the blockchain. And if it was, it would be just a nightmare trying to get the current data out, right? We're not going to be able to write even fast enough. But the idea behind this is to make your DeFi, your distributed application, really more reliable and globally precise, especially if you're using pricing data from private or public feeds. So understanding where all this stuff comes from, like sports, supply chain, economic data, public and private data feeds, census information. There's a wide range of data that's just not going to be viable living on the blockchain itself, right? So with that in mind, you're going to be using an awful lot of off-chain data. Now, one of the other things that's interesting too is that sometimes you need some really specialized data like proof of reserve, right? So proof of reserve audits are for stablecoins and cross-chain assets, and these will help your DeFi applications mitigate fractional reserves' negative effects. So you've got some other real reasons why you're going to use off-chain, using things for e-signatures, credentials, domain names, IAM, oracles, all the stuff you're going to use to verify user identity. All of that's going to be off-chain. And this is where this gets to be interesting. You have a mix of chain data and then you have a mix of off-chain data. And how to make all this stuff work correctly can be really interesting. And some of it you're going to do in part of your contract. Some of it you're just going to do as part of just being a blockchain programmer working in Solidity. So off-chain storage, huge issue right now, especially for data that's too big to store. And it can be things like movies, it can be things like music, it can be things like pictures, it can be just big blocks of binary data, census data. So all this stuff, all your non-transactional data, right, that makes sense. You're just going to go ahead and put a link to it or a pointer to it, right? You can use something like the cloud. You can use S3, especially if you're using Amazon's managed blockchain. Same thing for Azure, same thing for Google Cloud, right? Or if you don't want to deal with them, you can use interplanetary file system to read and write data off of those blockchain locations. It's just really, really super handy to have things like that, especially for auctions, NFTs, things like that, movies, however you want to manage your data. Off-chain data storage is going to be something you're going to do. The other one I like too is for data that's too expensive to calculate in the contract. You may have some really big, huge math that's going to go down in your contract, and it's going to be super expensive. It will have a huge gas price, and you don't want to pay that. It's just better to calculate it off contract and then return it back to the contract. Just so you get your variable, you check it, you run your math off chain, then you send that variable back, right? The other thing that's interesting too is needed to meet regulations like GDPR. And there's a bunch of regulations forming now for the blockchain, and it's guaranteed after all the bull that's been going on with blockchain lately. You know that there's going to be a lot more regulations, and some of this is going to require off-chain data storage, especially when it comes to things like HIPAA, privacy, right to be forgotten, all these things that we're going to be doing along the way. There's also going to be some infrastructure that you need to worry about. Based on the definition of off-chain, you'll need to run some form of traditional software and storage to run. Now that opens the door to everything under OWASP. There's a whole section on OWASP here, but really, in all honesty, it really is all about how do you write blockchain and into off-chain storage using traditional programming, right? Traditional systems. So that you need to work out of, especially if you're going to do contracting that's automated for this, right? Especially if I'm going to sell links to a movie or something else. You just want to make sure that you have in place in your flow control how all this works And then what happens if all of your off-chain stuff gets hacked? Right? You may have the most secure contract ever. It's solid. But your person that's doing all the off-chain stuff, not so good, right? Your boss, how much did you pay him kind of thing. So make sure you are QAing all this stuff as you kind of go through the process to make sure that you are set for your off-chain infrastructure, because you're going to want it. The other one too is Oracle. We do cover a section on here on Oracle data in this series, so just be really aware, go through that. But you want to make sure you're validating the data, getting the data from a trusted source. Now there's two types of oracles to work with, centralized and decentralized. Both have trust security concerns, and you just need to be aware of that when you're writing your code, and plan for downtime, plan for something to go down, plan for data to be outside of bounds, time aware for all the data that's coming in off the Oracle. How many times do you pull the Oracle? There are a lot of considerations into oracles, especially if you're going to use them. And you are going to use them, especially if you're doing value transactions, like converting from one form of currency to another form of currency. You want to make sure you are up to date on these numbers, and you're going to use an external oracle to make sure of that. Now, the other thing that happens with this is that distributed apps has significantly changed where and how off-chain data is used, right? And you kind of see this with insurance and with NFTs that are using off-chain data for faster calculations and better scalability, especially if you have a rush for the NFT, right? I'm not saying anything, but the recent NFT auction where they limited you to 9 or X amount of dollars, they did a lot of those calculations off-chain and just made for a really smooth NFT auction, really scalable. The other thing I thought was interesting too is using off-chain data for unstructured data, which I thought was an interesting approach as well, especially if you're selling art, if you're selling anything that is, not basically transactional data. Unstructured data can be really fascinating to store off and then try to sell via on-chain mechanisms. Now, there's some real big advantages to doing off-chain storage, right? Keep the block size chain down. From what I'm understanding, the blockchain itself right now is about a little over 1 terabit in size, so it's pretty honking huge. That's a lot of data, right? And it can be a pain trying to search the blockchain for some kind of core data, which can be slow, without additional infrastructure and cost. The other thing too that's makes it interesting too is to financial market data, especially prediction data. It's costly to run, so you really don't want to be running that on the blockchain. You're going to want to be running that in a data warehouse, doing some kind of data repository process so that you can run that data and use to hedge financial holdings. This is all just better off the chain. You don't want to be doing it on the chain. There are also some really good advantages, especially when you have a large flow data, moving data. That's high velocity data is a good way of putting it, right? So prediction data, all of this stuff is better stored and used for off-chain from a trusted source. Supply chain tracking, IoT, sensor data, it would just overwhelm the blockchain in a heartbeat. You don't ever want to store user identity on the blockchain. You just have to have some kind of user management. All that's going to be off-chain. And then stablecoin reserves management for real-time supported token value. That's another important consideration for this. Now, the big advantage, again, is saving money on transaction fees, but you are going to pay for storage as off-chain location as well as the network and other costs. So you want to balance the two and make sure what you're doing is really what you want to be doing, and you've got the money to pay for it. Now, in summary, off-chain data can be a lot easier to access. Like tons easier. Off-chain data can meet legal or regulatory requirements for data protection, and there's some kind of data like user management that just really needs to be off the chain. And with that in mind, I'll see you in the next lecture.